Hello, everyone. Welcome to our recording of our visiting vignette on TAVR. And we're going to explain what TAVR stands for in a little bit. But the visiting vignettes are a series of short videos, a short webinar type videos on the patient perspective on all sorts of different conditions. And we are lucky enough today to have Larry Haffner here, and he is going to talk about aortic stenosis and TAVR. So without further ado, Larry, I'm going to turn it over to you to tell us a little bit to start with about your story and about your experience with aortic stenosis.
Okay, well, thanks, Jody. Real quickly, I have had it's now a 29-year journey with heart issues, and the TAVR was one of those chapters along the way. For me, it happened actually in 2012, we started seeing my aortic stenosis. We had a diagnosis before that, but 2012, the diagnosis went from mild to moderate, but he didn't want to do anything. And we talked about TAVR, but he thought it was too new at the time. By 2013, I had a lot of the symptoms that go and increasingly out of breath, tired all the time, and just feeling poorly. And we did another echo, and sure enough, my aortic stenosis had gone from moderate to severe, and I kept feeling worse. And my cardiologist and I looked at each other and said, how about TAVR? And so he recommended that to me, and I had that. So it has been almost 9 years. It'll be 9 years this Memorial Day since I've had my TAVR.
Wow. And from your perspective, Larry, can you explain to us, tell us what TAVR stands for, and can you explain to us what TAVR is?
TAVR stands for transcatheter aortic valve replacement. Some places will say TAVI, T-A-V-I. I means, insertion, but either way, it's replacing. What they do is they usually come up through the groin, although they can come in other ways with a catheter, and they bring the equipment up into your heart. They push all of that stenosis, all of that calcified stuff that's blocking your aortic opening out of the way, and they push the bad valve leaflets out of the way, and they simply just slide. It's on the end of a catheter. They slide that. It's been crimped on there. They slide that into the opening and pop it open. A couple different ways to do that, but that's generally what they do. That they pop it open, and all of a sudden you've got a new aortic valve.
Wow. And it is really exciting. And for those of you who are unaware, it is an alternative to having surgery to replace your valve. And so this is a different way without having heart surgery to replace the valve. And Larry, we have a question. What they want to know a little bit more about your symptoms, and did you have COPD or any other breathing disorders before your TAVR?
No, I did not. I've had other cardiac procedures. I had a ton of AFib that I've fought over the year, but I did not have any COPD or breathing. I do have diabetes, and I do have some thyroid disease issue, but nothing that really pertains to the TAVR. The biggest thing that impacted the TAVR decision for them was that they want to open I'd had 2 previous bypass surgeries and had my chest open twice, and they didn't want to open it a third time. There was some real risk. And that's why the TAVR was just actually still mind-boggling to me, both in terms of how it works and how well it worked for me. And that's why we went the TAVR route.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of things that impacted your decision, were there other things that influenced your decision to have a TAVR?
In my case, not really. Having had my chest open twice before, I knew from their perspective, they were telling me why they didn't want to go in for a third time, why it would be very problematic and very risky. But I also didn't want it open. I know what the recovery time is. I know the time in rehab. I know how long it takes to recover from open heart sternotomy. And I simply didn't want that done. So I was excited about the TAVR.
Yeah. And at the time when you had the TAVR, it was only for very high risk patients like yourself. And now the TAVR is open to a wide variety of patients.
Yeah,
So
it used to be the surgery. I mean, it used to be the procedure of last resort, and now it's their procedure of first resort. It's the first thing that they look to do. They would rather do that even than for a healthy person than to go in and open the chest.
right. And we know there are certain qualifications you have to meet in order to have a TAVR, but for people who qualify, can you tell us how it went for you? How did it go?
The procedure itself, or
Yes.
well,
yes.
now we have to keep in mind it's 9 years ago, so a lot of protocols and procedure, it's the medical things just changed so dramatically, and I was very early in the process, so I had full anesthesia. They don't do that anymore. Now it's the twilight sleep. It's really not much different than getting a stent put in. They run the catheter up there, they wake you up. You feel, in my case, you feel great. Can't believe how bad you felt, but now you feel great. And they may keep you one night overnight. Back then, they wanted to keep me 3 nights overnight. I ended up being home on the 3rd day, but regardless, now it's much quicker and much more, I'll say, uneventful. They've been refining the devices that they use. They define the technology that they use, the catheter assemblies that they use to deliver that it's been just dramatic improvement over the last 9 years.
Yeah. So speaking of that, I know, several different companies make the valves that they use. And we have a lot of questions about, are they mechanical valves? Are they different valves?
You mean the TAVR? The TAVR
Yes.
is a bioprosthesis. In other words, it's an animal tissue valve. So it is definitely not mechanical. A lot of times they would talk to you about, if you're having a surgical valve, do you want the mechanical or do you want the biological one? And there were different time constraints. I mean, in terms of how long the product was, life expectancy of the device and all of that. But it is simply a bioprosthesis. And they, at the time I had it, they weren't 100% sure of how long the device would last. They thought it would last as long as the ones that they were putting in with surgery. And as it turns out, it does last that long. So.
Yeah, well, that is good news for everyone, I'm sure. In terms of your recovery, I know you talked a little bit about how you woke up and you felt great. But what other things should people know about recovery? And knowing everyone is different, everyone recovers differently. Did you have to be on medications? How long did it take for you to feel back to normal? That kind of thing.
Well, very honestly, I think I went to cardiac, even though they wasn't recommended necessarily by the cardiologist, although he signed off on it. I went to cardiac rehab for a 3rd time. Although I felt great immediately. And back then, you have to be careful, as they do with any of the time they go up with a catheter into your heart. There's a day or two they don't want you doing much and reduced activity and so forth. But it really, recovery time was next to nothing. And in fact, what I tell people when I talk to them about the TAVR, because as I'm talking with people who are considering it and they're worried about it, I say, look, and some people say, well, I don't feel that bad, or I don't have the symptoms, or I'm asymptomatic. And I said, you probably have more symptoms than you know. And you really don't know how that aortic stenosis is negatively impacting you until it's fixed. And I know some people think I'm joking when I say I felt like I could get right up off the table and walk and leave. Of course, they wouldn't let me do that. But it was amazing how much better I felt and how quickly that happened. The medications really I didn't have to change. I was taking a blood thinner anyway for other reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So there might be some blood thinners initially that they'll want you on, some platelet types of medication, but there really wasn't any change in my medications.
Yeah. There were a lot of questions about, did you have to be on blood thinners? So that's a possibility.
Unlike the mechanical, if you have one of the mechanical valves surgically put in, you're on a blood thinner. In fact, you're on Coumadin, probably for the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. But if you have a bioprosthesis, an animal tissue valve, it might be for a little bit until things settle down, maybe up to 6 months, something like that. But then you don't have to be on a blood thinner. unless you are like I am, have other problems that require that.
Yes. Well, that's always good to know for people when they're considering it. And those are questions you definitely want to ask your doctor ahead of time before the TAVR. And we do have a discussion guide. Mended Hearts has a discussion guide online on aortic stenosis. So be sure there are questions to ask your doctor on there too. So be sure to check that out. What is something that surprised you the most about having a TAVR?
Outside of how much better I felt so quickly.
Yes.
Again, it was 9 years ago, and I went to a very large hospital in the St. Louis area, and they were surprised by how young I was, relatively speaking.
Right.
In fact, they would be looking around for the 80 or 90-year-old that just had the TAVR, and I was not that. So I think that's the one that surprised me the most. I was worried about how long the TAVR would last. Obviously, I'm finding through the time passing, that's lasting a long time. But one of the things that they also do now is they can do a TAVR inside of a TAVR. So if your TAVR starts failing again for any reason, and they're starting to hear it. He heard this last time, just heard a little bit of a murmur starting again on the aortic valve, probably being some more stenosis happening, but that's my genetic draw in the pool, I guess. But the worst that probably will happen is that if they have to replace that again, they don't replace it. They'll just simply slide another TAVR inside of that valve. And in fact, TAVRs, they're using TAVRs for people that had a bioprosthesis, had an animal tissue valve put in surgically. If it starts to fail, they can come through and put a TAVR inside of that one. So
yeah, it's so amazing what technology can do today, isn't it? It just it makes you feel good about being able to have a bunch of options. And that's one of the things that is very important for people to know, is that there are options, and different options will be for different people. You may not be able to have a TAVR, but you at least can know about it and right. Ask if this is an option for you, right?
That's correct. And more hospitals now have a heart valve team approach. That was actually one of the outcomes of the early TAVRs. Is, there'll be a surgeon, there'll be your cardiologist, the interventional cardiologist, there'll be people that specialize in anesthesia for this type of procedure. There'll be a nurse anyway. So they have these teams, and they will talk with you through all the different options and what's probably best for your situation, your age, your other health problems, if you have any, et cetera.
Yeah. One of the things occasionally we'll hear people say to us at Mended Hearts is they say, well, they're starting to feel bad, and they think a lot of it has to do with aging. And they also say, well, I've lived a good life, so I'm good, I'm happy. Can you please speak to that a little bit?
Well, here's how I look at it. And I had one support call that I don't know how many phone calls and how many emails exchanges it went on. And I had a lot of trouble convincing them because the person was wary about having the TAVR. He said just those things, a little tired, but I don't have symptoms. The bottom line is the prognosis for aortic stenosis is that within 2 years, there's maybe 50% survival rate. Within 5 years, there's only a 20% survival rate. So the bottom line with aortic stenosis is you have to have it fixed, either surgically or via a TAVR, but you have to have it fixed, or very bluntly, you're gonna have terrible quality of life, gets worse and worse, and eventually it'll do you in. You'll die. So you've got to do something. If you've got aortic stenosis, and especially if it moves to the severe point, you've got to do something.
Yeah, and the questions came in the chat box that or in the Q&A that people were concerned about, like, was there a 2-year survival with TAVR? And just to be clear, the 50% 2-year survival is if you don't have something done,
That's
have
correct.
treatment.
Yeah, right. Yes. If you've got severe aortic stenosis, you got to get it fixed. You got to address it.
Yes, and that, like Larry, you can feel so much better afterwards. We had one patient who talked to one of our visitors who was 80 years old, had the TAVR, was feeling great, doing great, and this man was 72. And he said, "How old are you? And did you have the TAVR?" Because he was thinking he was just going to do nothing, and our visitor said he was 80 and feeling wonderful, and he was out on the golf course. And so the guy ended up having the TAVR, called him and said, "Do you know where I am?" He was on the golf course. So I
And
bet he was very glad he chose the TAVR.
yeah, and the recovery time after a TAVR, well, let me back up just a second. As I do support, when I call people that are considering having to have a TAVR or trying to weigh the difference between surgically or a TAVR, I find that there's three broad categories of people. There are those that have had no experience whatsoever. This is their first heart problem. They've had no experience with any of the procedures, and they're scared. And they're the ones usually with the most questions. Then at the far end, there's the people like me that have had open heart surgery for either for bypass or for heart replace or valve replacement or other issues. And we want the TAVR. We don't want to have that chest open again. And those people, in many ways, when I talk to those patients, they're some of the easiest ones to deal with because they've been through it and they know how much it hurt and so forth. And then, but there's a lot of people in the middle too that have had some cardiac problems, stents, maybe they've had an RF ablation for AFib, something where they've gone up and they're not always sure, but they at least have a little base of experience. But the people I feel always the most sorry for are the first ones, they've never had any experience and they're scared, and understandably so.
Yes. Yeah. And it is understandable to be scared about any major medical procedure. This is not without risk. It's not just,
Right.
A minor procedure. It's a major procedure. And so, people wake up and they feel great, but not to minimize the procedure itself. It's a major procedure.
That's correct.
Yes. So the final question I have for you today is, what would you like other patients to know about aortic stenosis and TAVR?
The TAVR is a very elegant solution, and one in terms of, yes, there's risk with any procedure, but if you compare it to the risk associated with open heart surgery, I still am mind-boggling about how it works and who designed it and how they figured that out. But is that you really need to have the aortic stenosis addressed. You have to have it, or you won't have any kind of quality of life and you'll die younger. You have to have it addressed, and the TAVR is an elegant solution. It is now the first choice, even for those people that don't even have severe aortic stenosis yet. They're using it for mild and even some people with moderate aortic stenosis to get in there and do that quickly to provide a better quality of life over the years.
Well, Larry, you are a wealth of wonderful information, and I'm just going to thank people with our closing slide really quickly. And I want to make sure that I thank Edwards Life Sciences for their educational grant that allowed us to put on this visiting vignette on TAVR today. And again, Larry, thank you. You have been absolutely wonderful, and we appreciate you being here with us today.
Well, I enjoyed it, and I'll make the same offer I make to anybody I do a support call with. If you got questions, you give me a call. Call Mended Hearts, and they'll match me up, and we'll do a support call. If you have questions, I don't guarantee I can't answer medical questions. I can't guarantee I can answer your question, but we can talk about it.
Yes, and we do match people up with Larry quite a bit. And again, if you want to know more about aortic stenosis, about TAVR, we have wonderful resources at www.mendedhearts.org. And we thank all of you for being with us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.